over the South China Sea, 1967. 30,000 feet above the haze, an American F-4 Phantom sliced through thin air, twin J-79 engines roaring at military power. Fuel gauges fell like countdown timers. The pilot's hand moved, not to push harder, but to pull back. Both throttles rolled to idle. Silence. Only the whistle of air past the canopy. The Phantom began a long, shallow glide toward the coastline. To anyone watching radar, it looked like a dying jet, an engine flameout. But to the men in that cockpit, this wasn't panic. It was discipline. They were killing their jet, cutting thrust on purpose to save the most precious thing in modern air war: range. Every pound of fuel mattered. Each mile of glide was a chance to make it home. This quiet technique, born from desperation, refined through physics, and taught in every U.S. flight school, would double the reach of American fighters, redefine air tactics, and prove one timeless truth. Sometimes, the smartest pilots are the ones who know when to let go. When the Second World War ended, the sky filled with a new sound, the deep metallic howl of jet propulsion. America entered the jet age with the pride of a victor and the burden of a pioneer. Yet the very engines that promised unmatched speed also delivered a harsh new limitation. First, the first generations of U.S. jet aircraft, the F-80 Shooting Star, F-84 Thunderjet, and F-86 Sabre, could sprint like no piston fighter ever had. But they devoured fuel faster than planners could move the tankers. In Korea, Sabre pilots discovered that their dazzling speed often meant just minutes of combat before the needle hit empty. In the 1950s, the Air Force pushed higher and faster, fielding the F-100, F-101, and F-104, machines built for Mach 1 and beyond. But the laws of thermodynamics were unforgiving. At altitude, jet turbines sipped air efficiently. Down low, they gulped kerosene like open furnaces. The new generation of pilots learned quickly. To fly a jet well was to manage fuel, not just fight. Instructors began hammering into students that every maneuver had a price. Climb too steeply, and you'd cut minutes off your endurance. Stay low and fast, and your range would collapse by half. Every mission briefing included a figure written in grease pencil on the kneeboard. Bingo. That number meant the fuel level at which you turn for home or die trying. During the 1960s, the Vietnam War turned fuel from a logistical concern into a life-or-death equation. Strike aircraft launched from carriers hundreds of miles offshore, or from bases in Thailand and the Philippines. Combat over the north required long afterburning climbs through monsoon weather, weaving through surface-to-air missile envelopes, and returning through enemy interceptors. Tankers, KC-135s, or Navy Ka-3s orbited predictable racetracks, but they couldn't cover every contingency. It was in this crucible that U.S. pilots started refining a method that seemed counterintuitive. Turn the engines off and live longer. Not truly off, of course. Idle thrust, minimal fuel flow, the turbines barely sustaining rotation. By flying high, clean, and patient, they discovered they could stretch endurance dramatically. Some even joked that the most powerful tool in the cockpit wasn't the afterburner switch. It was restraint. Training commands institutionalized the habit. In the Air Force's T-38 Talon, cadets practiced simulated flameout approaches, SFOs. Engine at idle, nose adjusted for the energy circle, pattern flown entirely on potential energy. In the Navy, carrier aviators drilled fuel-critical recoveries, using glide paths calculated from altitude and distance rather than thrust and time. What began as an emergency procedure became a mindset, a way of thinking about flight energy itself. The concept meshed perfectly with evolving aerodynamic science. Engineers defined a point on every aircraft's performance chart known as LD max, the lift-to-drag ratio where the machine traveled farthest for every pound of thrust. Stay near that number, and you achieved best glide. Push beyond it, and every knot cost miles. The pilot who understood this could outlast the one who chased speed. By the late 1960s, squadrons from Okinawa to Da Nang kept notebooks filled with these figures. A Phantom crew departing on a long sortie might brief 30,000 feet, throttle to idle, hold 250 knots, 1-degree descent, maximum range. The radar intercept officer would track distance to go against remaining fuel, calling out, "You're in the black," when they'd earned back enough margin for recovery. For many, these lessons came at the cost of burned turbines and lost friends. Jet fuel miscalculations were among the leading causes of non-combat losses. A mis-set power lever or an optimistic mission plan could drain tanks minutes too soon. The phrase, "killing your jet," carried both irony and reverence. It meant trusting physics and training when instinct screamed for power. By the end of the decade, the practice had become an art. Pilots could visualize their aircraft as a gliding weapon, each 1,000 feet of altitude equal to miles of range, each knot a balance between lift and drag. It was the quiet side of air combat, a discipline invisible on radar, but essential to survival. And yet, while the technique was proving itself in Southeast Asia, scientists and tacticians back home were asking a deeper question. How far could the jet age really go if its warriors kept running out of gas? The search for that answer would turn into a revolution in flight profiles, engine efficiency, and aerial strategy. A transformation that began not in the roar of takeoff, but in the eerie silence of a throttled-back sky. Every aircraft ever built is a compromise between power and patience. The early jet age proved that sheer thrust could win dogfights, but not wars of endurance. Engineers at Edwards, NACA, and Wright-Patterson began charting what pilots were already sensing in their bones. Range wasn't just a matter of fuel quantity, it was geometry, drag, and gravity in delicate balance. They called it specific range, the distance flown per unit of fuel burned. At its core, it was governed by one elegant equation, LDX, Sauter-1, specific fuel consumption. Lift-to-drag ratio told how efficiently wings turned forward motion into lift. Specific fuel consumption measured how much fuel the engine demanded for every pound of thrust. Together, they decided whether a jet could cross continents or barely make it to the next tanker. The higher a plane flew, the thinner the air, and the lower the drag. But there was a catch. As altitude rose, engines lost thrust and combustion stability. Early turbojets, like the J-47 and J-79, were notorious for compressor stalls and flameouts above certain heights if throttled too quickly. So designers and pilots learned to step climb, ascend gradually as fuel burned off and weight decreased. Each 1,000 feet gained translating directly into range. In peacetime manuals, these profiles became codified. Optimum cruise, long-range cruise, endurance cruise. But in combat, the math turned personal. Over Vietnam, an F-4 Phantom might loiter at 36,000 feet, throttles barely cracked, each engine burning less than 1,000 pounds of fuel per hour, a tenth of what full afterburner demanded. Then, when threat radars lit up, the crew would drop the nose, spool up the turbines and dive for home, converting altitude into kinetic escape energy. This dance between power and gravity became a fine art. Pilots learned that 1,000 feet of altitude could be traded for roughly 2 nautical miles of glide. 10,000 feet meant 20 miles, enough to cross a coastline or reach a tanker orbit. Charts were taped inside canopies, tiny graphs plotting distance versus altitude at idle. They were not theoretical. They were survival maps. And yet, this wasn't just about staying airborne. It was about strategic mobility. Every gallon saved on one sortie meant more missions per tanker, more flexibility for command. The U.S. Air Force's vast aerial refueling network, the quiet backbone of modern air power, owed its efficiency to these pilot-level fuel disciplines. A flight of 4 F-105s that could stretch fuel by 15% didn't just save money. They freed up one tanker for another mission. By the 1970s, the lessons hardened into doctrine. Fighter weapons school instructors in Nevada and Miramar began integrating fuel efficiency into tactical syllabi. A young pilot might master dogfighting one week and spend the next learning how to dead stick from altitude to a runway threshold. Not for emergencies, but for energy management awareness. Engineers even started designing cockpits around the concept. The F-15 Eagle, for instance, included an advanced fuel flow indicator that allowed pilots to fine-tune specific range in real time. It was no coincidence that these same decades saw dramatic improvements in global reach. Aircraft like the SR-71 Blackbird and the B-52 Stratofortress didn't just rely on raw thrust. They relied on meticulously optimized cruise profiles that milked every drop of JP-7 or JP-4. The Blackbird, flying at 80,000 feet and Mach 3, achieved surprisingly high fuel efficiency for its speed by staying at near-perfect aerodynamic equilibrium. Proof that understanding the physics of range wasn't about flying slower, but flying smarter. Within fighter culture, though, there remained a philosophical divide. Some pilots derided fuel weenies, those obsessed with charts and flow meters, preferring the swagger of full afterburner. But those who survived long-range sorties knew better. They'd seen the math written in vapor trails. A controlled idle descent from 40,000 feet could cover over 100 miles without a drop more fuel. By the close of the Vietnam War, what began as emergency improvisation had matured into a quiet doctrine of its own. Part aerodynamics, part discipline, part humility. A generation of aviators had discovered that endurance, not aggression, often decided who lived to fly again. This evolution, from fire-breathing jets to pilots, mastering silence, set the stage for the next chapter of the story, the human side of killing your jet. Because beyond equations and flight manuals, it was judgment that made the difference between burning out and making it home. When the jet age reached maturity in the 1970s, the United States military realized that technology alone wasn't enough to win wars in the sky. It required pilots who understood energy as intimately as engineers did. Killing your jet wasn't just a quirk or trick anymore. It became a mindset trained into muscle memory from the first flight in a trainer cockpit. Training and Simulated Flameout Patterns, SFOs. At bases from Laughlin to Vance, thousands of Air Force trainees in the nimble T-38 Talon learned to glide before they learned to fight. The instructor would pull both throttles to idle at altitude and say calmly, "You just lost both engines. Now, fly it home." The student had to judge energy, not power. No thrust, no second chances, only glide geometry, airspeed control, and precise pattern entry. The Simulated Flameout approach, or SFO, became a ritual of airmanship. Each phase of the glide had names: high key, overhead position; low key, abeam, the runway; and base key, final turn. The goal was to arrive over the threshold exactly on profile. Not too high, not too low, proving mastery of kinetic energy. For decades, this discipline shaped the American pilot's brain. Whether flying an F-15, an A-10, or a C-17, every aviator who came through undergraduate training could visualize distance and altitude like a mathematical instinct. It was one of the quietest skills in aviation, but also one of the deadliest when fuel ran out or engines quit. Tactical fuel math. The bingo and joker mindset in squadron ready rooms, whiteboards glowed with two critical words: bingo and joker. These weren't slang, they were survival numbers. Joker fuel was the point to begin thinking about returning to base. Bingo was the hard line. Time to go. No debate. The system created mental discipline under chaos. Pilots learned to calculate burn rates at each phase: ingress, attack, egress, climb, and recovery. In Vietnam, F-105 Thunder Chief pilots memorized fuel flow tables by heart. At 450 knots and 30,000 feet, 4,800 pounds per hour, the precision bordered on obsession because the difference between 200 pounds of fuel could mean reaching a tanker or punching out over Laos. This arithmetic extended beyond safety. It affected strategy itself. Commanders planned entire operations, like Linebacker 2 in 1972, around tanker range rings and bingo points. A flight leader who pushed too far into hostile airspace without conserving fuel risked not only his own life, but the success of the mission. Thus, fuel discipline became synonymous with professionalism. Altitude strategy: climb, glide, repeat altitude was life. A pilot who understood how to manage it could rewrite the limits of his jet. At 35,000 feet, an F-4 Phantom could glide nearly 100 nautical miles at idle power. At 15,000, it might only manage 30. That difference dictated whether a crew lived to debrief or became names on the missing list. Instructors drilled this relentlessly. Burn high, coast low. Strike aircraft would climb as they exited target zones, engines at military power until they reached the thin upper air. Then came the silence. Throttles to idle, wings level. Descent planned to the home tanker or base. They called it a dead stick leg. The irony was brutal. The best way to save the jet was to kill it. This altitude strategy carried into every branch. Navy pilots returning from long range. Sorties over the Tonkin Gulf learned to time their descents precisely to arrive over the carrier at pattern altitude with a safe, trapped fuel state, usually 2,000 pounds. Too much throttle on the way down, and they risked fuel starvation before recovery. Too little, and they risked missing the pattern. Energy management as a combat skill. What began as a survival method soon evolved into a tactical weapon. Instructors at Top Gun and Fighter Weapons School realized that the same principles governing fuel efficiency also governed air combat maneuvering. Energy management wasn't just about range, it was about life expectancy in a dogfight. The energy maneuverability theory, pioneered by Colonel John Boyd, mathematically linked an aircraft's energy state, speed plus altitude, to its combat options. A pilot who could control energy could dictate the fight. Boyd's theories changed everything from tactics to design philosophy, culminating in aircraft like the F-15 and F-16 built around sustained energy retention. Suddenly, the phrase "killing your jet" gained dual meaning. Conserving fuel and controlling fight geometry both came from the same discipline, knowing when not to push the throttle. From the desert bases of Nellis to the decks of carriers in the Pacific, this quiet revolution in flight philosophy defined a generation of American aviators. Their skill wasn't measured in raw aggression, but in judgment. The calm decision to pull power, to trust glide and gravity over thrust and fear. As training sharpened and technology evolved, a new set of contrasts began to appear. Between services, aircraft, and cultures, each branch developed its own interpretation of fuel mastery. Carrier versus land-based culture. Precision in the blue water, void for naval aviators, the ocean was an unforgiving horizon. Unlike their Air Force counterparts, carrier pilots had no friendly airfield options if they miscalculated fuel. The ship was the runway, a moving, pitching, postage stamp of safety in 100 miles of nothing. This shaped an entire culture of fuel discipline. Carrier air wings briefed with almost ritualistic precision. Fuel on deck 2.0, bingo to beach 3.5. That meant every pilot had to trap aboard with at least 2,000 pounds remaining. And if they missed 3 times, divert to a land base with no margin for error. In the 1960s and 70s, recovery tankers orbited every carrier group. Old A-3 Sky Warriors and Ka-6 Intruders with refueling pods, serving as lifelines. Yet even they had limits. Commanders demanded that returning jets descend on a narrow, fuel-optimized profile. High cruise outbound, idle back inbound. No wasted turns, no unnecessary power. A single misjudged descent could mean running out of fuel within sight of the deck. Instructors hammered the point in training. You can't fight the ocean. Respect your numbers. To this day, U.S. Navy flight schools call this mindset fuel integrity, the unbreakable rule that energy management is as sacred as weapons delivery. Airframes and manuals. How design reinforced. Disciplined aircraft engineers didn't just admire pilots' efficiency. They built it into the machines themselves. By the mid-1970s, flight manuals reflected decades of blood-earned data. Each model's Dash 1 or NATOPS volume included pages titled Maximum Range Glide, Idle Descent Schedule, and Optimum Cruise. For the F-4 Phantom, charts specified that at 250 knots and 33,000 feet, the jet achieved its best lift-to-drag ratio. The A-7 Corsair II manual instructed pilots to climb to step cruise altitude after weapons release to maximize endurance. The F-14 Tomcat, designed for long-range fleet defense, carried a fuel computer that allowed RIOs, radar intercept officers, to constantly recalculate range and bingo on the fly. In the Air Force, the F-111 Aardvark introduced fully automated navigation and fuel optimization, a machine that could think its way to efficiency during terrain-following flight. Pilots learned to trust the numbers but never surrender instinct. When in doubt, idle, glide, and listen to the airframe. These design philosophies transcended generations. Modern fighters like the F-15E Strike Eagle and F/A-18 Hornet carried the DNA of this thinking. Built-in energy awareness through advanced fuel flow meters, miles per pound calculators, and energy management symbology projected directly onto HUDs. Yet the essence remained the same as it had in 1950. Efficiency was survival, not convenience. The human factor. Calm in the empty tank behind every chart and procedure stood a pilot fighting biology itself. When low fuel lights blinked, heart rates spiked. The instinct was primal. Panic, power up, climb for safety. But discipline meant the opposite. Stay calm, stay idle, stay smart. Stories circulated across generations. A Navy pilot returning from a night strike off Vietnam, both engines sputtering, dead-sticked his A-4 Skyhawk onto the carrier deck with less than 100 pounds of fuel. An Air Force captain in an F-16 over Saudi Arabia during Desert Storm flamed out 30 miles short of base, glided the jet through clouds, and restarted at 7,000 feet, landing with fumes in the tanks. Neither were accidents of luck. Both were products of a culture that treated energy as a living language. The feel of control surfaces, the whisper of airflow, the gut sense of distance left in the glide. Veteran instructors often said, "You fly the fuel, not the jet." In debriefs, they'd analyze idle descents with the same scrutiny as missile shots. Young pilots learned that judgment mattered more than reflex. To pull power early took courage. It meant trust in data, training, and one's own nerves. To stay composed as the cockpit went quiet separated the professional from the reckless. This psychological discipline became the hidden superpower of Western air forces. Soviet pilots trained for aggression. American pilots trained for management. The difference, small in theory, shaped entire wars. Because wars aren't only won by those who fight hardest, but by those who get home to fight again. By the late Cold War, every U.S. aviator carried within them the paradox that defined modern flight. Sometimes, the deadliest warriors were the ones who learned how to fall, with precision, patience, and purpose. As the Vietnam era ended and jet technology matured, a new kind of proving ground awaited. All the theory, charts, and training would be tested not in manuals, but in the violent reality of combat, where the difference between full throttle and idle could mean the life of an entire formation. At dawn, the humidity hung thick over the Gulf of Tonkin. On the deck of the USS Coral Sea, the morning launch began. 30 aircraft, their canopies beaded with condensation, engines shrieking in metallic chorus. The target, the Than Hoa Bridge, had defied U.S. air power for years, a symbol of North Vietnamese resilience and American frustration. Among the departing strike package was a pair of A-7E Corsairs, each armed with two 2,000-pound bombs and drop tanks nearly full. Commander Jack Donovan, call sign Razor 1, had flown this route dozens of times. He knew the numbers, range to target, time on station, tanker window, and the cruel arithmetic of return fuel. Bingo's 2.5. Joker 3.0. His wingman, Razor 2, confirmed over the radio. Donovan nodded. Copy. We'll earn our pay today. By mid-morning, the Corsairs were climbing through a gray shelf of clouds into clear blue. Ahead stretched 250 miles of contested airspace, SAM sites, MiG patrols, and the invisible limits of endurance. The aircraft were at max weight. Fuel burn peaked over 10,000 pounds per hour. Donovan eased back the throttles. The rumble softened, fuel flow dropping to 5,000. He wasn't being timid. He was being alive. The threat and the math they crossed into enemy radar range, warning receivers screamed. The flight broke formation, jinking through thin contrails. Donovan's heart hammered, but his mind stayed cold. He'd done the math. Every minute of full power here cost 10 miles of range later. His choice was brutal but simple. Burn now, die later, or glide and survive. By the time the Corsairs rolled into their dive toward Than Hoa, the fuel gauges were already dipping below 6,000 pounds. Bombs away! The bridge erupted in smoke and concrete fragments, shock waves rippling through the canopy. The jets leveled, turned southeast, and began the long run home. But something was wrong. A voice crackled on the radio. Razor 2 hit, leaking centerline tank. Losing fuel fast. Donovan looked at his gauges. His own numbers weren't good. The tanker orbit, Texaco, was another 180 miles away. They were both below the safe margin. No choice but to climb. Not for speed, but for glide. The decision to kill the jet, he leveled at 36,000 feet and pulled both throttles to idle. The world went quiet. Fuel flow dropped from thousands to a few hundred pounds per hour. The altimeter ticked down slowly. Beside him, Razor 2 followed, still leaking but stable. Going idle? Affirm, kill the jet. Ride the wind. In that moment, silence became strategy. The two Corsairs glided through thin air, trading altitude for range, trusting physics and faith. Donovan's training came back. Every SFO pattern. Every instructor's lecture. His eyes flicked between gauges and horizon. 35,000! 300 knots! 9-to-1 glide ratio. Do the math. At that profile, they could cover nearly 100 miles. Maybe enough. Minutes turned to eternity. The ocean appeared ahead, a silver mirror under the sun. The radios filled with tension. Texaco's on station. Angels 20. Donovan's internal calculation raced. Too low for a climb, too far for comfort. He needed one thing: time. At 15,000 feet, with barely 1,000 pounds of fuel left, he eased the throttles forward just enough to spin the turbines without losing speed. The J-52s coughed, caught, and hummed weakly. It was the sound of survival. The last miles below, a dark shape appeared on the horizon, a KC-135 tanker escorted by two F-4s. Donovan's RIO called, "We're inside 10 miles." He smiled grimly. "We're not there yet." At 5,000 feet, Razor 2's fuel lights blinked red. Donovan took the lead. "Plug first," he ordered. His wingman steadied behind the drogue basket, turbulence buffeting both jets. The connection clunked, a metallic kiss between life and gravity. Fuel began flowing. Moments later, Donovan's own tanks read near empty. The gauge needles hovered on zero, the engines still idling. He was gliding the last 1,000 yards toward the drogue. A heartbeat before the turbines starved, his probe connected. The cockpit filled with the faint scent of fuel vapor. Both men exhaled. They'd made it. The lesson written in silence back aboard the Coral Sea. Debriefing officers called it luck. Donovan knew better. It was discipline. The decision to pull power, to kill the jet, had saved them both. If they'd fought instinct and stayed on power, they'd have flamed out 20 miles short of rescue. That day's sortie became required study material in carrier squadrons. Charts were redrawn, manuals revised to emphasize idle power maximum range profiles. Donovan's crew chief, a quiet machinist from Illinois, later remarked, "It's strange, sir. We built engines to scream, but they save lives when they whisper." From that point onward, the phrase, "kill the jet," wasn't just slang, it became a creed, spoken half in jest, half in awe. It meant mastery of fear, of the machine, and of oneself. The quiet courage of those moments, throttles closed, horizon ahead, silence in the cockpit, would echo far beyond Vietnam. As America entered the modern age of precision warfare, that same principle would follow every generation of jet. Endurance through control, survival through calm. By the late 1970s, the lessons of Vietnam were inked into every checklist, syllabus, and simulator in the U.S. military. The pilots who'd learned to kill their jets returned home to become instructors, engineers, and test pilots. They carried with them not only combat scars, but a philosophy. That discipline in silence could save more lives than aggression in noise. The birth of fuel doctrine at Nellis Air Force Base. Instructors began codifying these experiences into a concept known as Energy Awareness Doctrine. It wasn't written in poetry or pilot folklore. It was math and repeatable procedure. Test squadrons flew endurance profiles in F-4s, F-111s, and F-15s to verify real-world glide ratios and fuel flows. Charts once scribbled on knee pads became laminated data cards, issued to every aircrew. Meanwhile, the Navy's Top Gun program at Miramar adapted its curriculum. Between air combat exercises, pilots practiced idle descents from 35,000 feet to carrier pattern altitude. A drill once seen as emergency only, now recognized as essential craft. "It's not about engines," one instructor said. "It's about judgment. The best fighter pilot isn't the one who wins the dogfight. It's the one who still has enough gas to land." These new doctrines didn't just refine tactics, they redefined what range meant in operational planning. A carrier strike group that previously required 3 tankers for recovery might now need 2. A bomber wing could hit a target 200 miles deeper without adding fuel weight or risk. The math had become strategy. The jet age grows up. The next generation of aircraft embodied this new thinking in metal and code. The F-15 Eagle, conceived in the wake of Vietnam's hard lessons, featured digital fuel computers that constantly calculated optimum altitude and thrust settings. Pilots could literally see their energy state projected onto the head-up display. The F-16 Fighting Falcon went further, designed around the energy maneuverability theory, able to convert speed to altitude and back with minimal loss. The machine rewarded restraint as much as aggression. The Air Force soon found that missions planned around these principles achieved not just longer range, but greater mission reliability. Pilots who conserved fuel early could stay on station longer, cover retreats, or react to unexpected threats. Commanders began structuring mission packages around energy envelopes rather than simple flight time. The Navy, too, evolved. With the arrival of the F-14 Tomcat, carrier air wings gained a long-range interceptor with extraordinary endurance when flown with finesse. Tomcat crews perfected a rhythm: full burn for intercept, idle cruise for return. A Tomcat could stretch its legs across the Atlantic with 2 aerial refuelings, but only if the crew treated every pound of JP-5 like blood. The turning point: Desert Storm and beyond in 1991. The Gulf War provided the first large-scale test of post-Vietnam energy doctrine. U.S. strike aircraft launched from Saudi bases and carriers in the Red Sea, flying missions that stretched thousands of miles. Fuel planning wasn't a detail, it was the war plan. Each sortie was timed to the minute with tanker brackets, recovery windows, and idle return legs. Pilots flew as much by the stopwatch as by the stick. An F-16 could take off with 7,000 pounds of fuel, reach Baghdad, attack, and glide halfway home before the first refuel. The math that had once been about survival was now an instrument of domination. Pilots who'd trained in the 1970s now commanded the squadrons. They spoke a common language of precision. Energy is life, they told their rookies. Throttle management wins wars. And for once, it wasn't hyperbole. Even stealth technology, the hallmark of the 1990s and 2000s, carried the same DNA. The F-117 Nighthawk's mission profiles emphasized smooth, deliberate power transitions to maintain radar invisibility and fuel economy. The B-2 Spirit bomber's range, intercontinental without refueling, relied on cruise profiles and power management principles traceable to those old idle descents over Vietnam. Culture of calm yet. Amid the technology and statistics, the human element never disappeared. Veterans emphasized that this discipline wasn't about algorithms, it was about attitude. Instructors at Shepherd and Kingsville began every debrief the same way. You're not flying a jet. You're flying energy. Young pilots learned to trust feel and flow. They were taught to let go, to close throttles and hear the air, to sense the line between lift and sink. In an age of automation, it remained the purest form of flying. By the early 2000s, even drone pilots, managing remotely piloted MQ-1 Predators and later MQ-9 Reapers, were applying the same heritage. Software calculated idle descents and endurance curves automatically. The machine could kill its jet without emotion, but the logic inside it was human-born. Save fuel, stretch range, survive the mission. The legacy becomes invisible today. Every mission plan in the U.S. Air Force or Navy includes what's called the fuel ladder, a chart that shows minimum endurance, best cruise, and idle recovery points. Few pilots think about where it came from. They don't realize that each number was written in sweat and fear by men like Donovan over the Tonkin Gulf, gliding dead stick toward salvation. In modern jets, computers do the arithmetic. But the philosophy, restraint, calculation, calm under pressure, remains human. When a pilot rolls the throttles back at altitude, they're echoing 70 years of experience distilled into one quiet decision. Live smart, not loud. That discipline, born from desperation, refined by science, and sustained through generations, forever changed the character of air warfare. From Vietnam's humid skies to Iraq's deserts and beyond, the art of killing your jet became the difference between pushing limits and surviving them. By the end of the Cold War, the phrase "kill your jet" had transcended slang. It had become part of the institutional bloodstream of Western aviation, an idea embedded in manuals, doctrine, and culture alike. The wars of the 20th century had begun with men who trusted engines. They ended with men who trusted energy. From lessons to doctrine. The U.S. Air Force's official technical orders and syllabi began reflecting this transformation in precise language. Flight manuals for every frontline aircraft contained a section titled Maximum Endurance and Range Procedures. Where once that information had been a few paragraphs of emergency guidance, now it occupied entire chapters. By the 1980s, Air Training Command had integrated simulated flameout recovery into every stage of flight instruction, not as an emergency maneuver, but as a habit of thought. Pilots were taught to think in ratios and trends, fuel to distance, altitude to time. In the Navy, NATOPS, Naval Air Training and Operating Procedures Standardization, manuals codified similar rules. Idle power descents were no longer improvisations. They were codified recovery techniques. Every launch and recovery cycle aboard carriers was now governed by a balance of tactical fuel allocation and emergency reserve standards. Instructors constantly repeated, "Plan for power, fly for glide." The institutional mindset shift was subtle but profound. Commanders and planners began to realize that wars weren't just won by firepower or speed, but by the ability to stay aloft longer than the enemy. A pilot who conserved energy could maintain air presence, loiter over targets, and project pressure for hours instead of minutes. This was no longer the realm of romantic fighter pilots. It was strategy rendered aerodynamic. Testing the doctrine. The modern era, the rise of multinational air operations after 1990, demanded fuel precision on a scale unseen before. Joint task forces coordinating dozens of aircraft over multiple theaters required synchronization down to the minute. Energy management became part of command lexicon, not just cockpit vocabulary. When Operation Allied Force unfolded over the Balkans in 1999, NATO planners coordinated thousands of sorties. They discovered that missions built on strict power discipline suffered fewer aborts and refueling conflicts. The pilots who stuck to idle return cruise profiles could execute longer loiter times, reducing tanker strain. In the Air Force's post-mission analysis, one phrase appeared repeatedly: fuel efficiency equals tactical flexibility. That sentence encapsulated half a century of evolution. New aircraft. Old wisdom, even as technology advanced, the fundamentals didn't fade. The F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning II, marvels of stealth and computation, carried forward generations of knowledge about fuel control. Their onboard computers continuously adjusted throttle schedules for maximum specific range, effectively automating what pilots like Jack Donovan once did by instinct. Yet instructors still emphasized awareness over automation. Simulators trained pilots to feel energy through G-loads, pitch, and time to altitude. Flight data systems might calculate the numbers, but judgment, the willingness to close throttles and trust glide, remained irreplaceable. Modern combat search and rescue crews, aerial tankers, and reconnaissance pilots all learned the same lesson through different missions. Endurance meant influence. A tanker pilot stretching a refuel orbit by 20 minutes could save a fighter. A drone operator extending loiter time could save a platoon. Passing down the culture today, young aviators at Shepherd, Kingsville, or Pensacola might not hear the phrase "kill your jet" as often, but they live by its essence. Instructors still challenge cadets with the same calm cruelty. Pull the throttles to idle at altitude and say, "Now, get home." The silence that follows is more than simulation. It's history. every glide path back to the runway carries echoes of Korea's first jets, Vietnam's smoky skies, and the long arcs of Phantoms returning over the Tonkin Gulf. The human legacy of restraint, of knowing when to fight and when to float, remains a badge of professional pride. That, ultimately, is the quiet victory of the jet age, the realization that in a world built on thrust, mastery comes not from noise, but from control. As the 21st century dawned, fuel discipline would merge with digital precision, creating a new synthesis of man and machine, the automation of judgment itself. Yet even as algorithms took over, the soul of the lesson stayed human. The modern battle space is wired, global, and algorithmic, but the old truths of flight still whisper beneath every mission plan. For all the satellites, data links, and predictive logistics that define 21st century air power, the pilot's most ancient enemy remains the same: distance versus fuel. The digital pilot and the algorithm of caution. When the first generation of stealth fighters entered service, many assumed that fuel management would become a solved problem. Computers could calculate glide ratios, tanker rendezvous, and optimum cruise profiles to decimal accuracy. Yet the people who designed those systems, veterans of Vietnam and Desert Storm, ensured that human intuition remained central. Inside the F-35 Lightning II, the pilot no longer estimates range with pencil and paper. Instead, an onboard system called Prognostic Health Management continuously analyzes thrust settings, atmospheric density, and drag coefficient, updating a live fuel-to-distance prediction on the helmet display. But when a pilot reduces throttle to idle on descent, the sensation, that eerie, purposeful quiet, is unchanged from the days of the A-7 Corsair. Engineers even programmed subtle feedback into the flight control software. The jet encourages optimal profiles, automatically trimming surfaces to minimize drag during low-power flight. What was once a hard-earned instinct is now a partnership between pilot and machine, a conversation across generations. Logistics becomes strategy beyond cockpits. Fuel conservation has become grand strategy. Every drop of jet fuel moved across oceans costs time, risk, and money. During the long wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, convoys delivering JP-8 fuel were among the most targeted logistics operations on Earth. A single aerial tanker sortie could determine whether fighters reached their targets or grounded early. TATCs. To planners at the Air Mobility Command, fuel efficiency ceased to be an environmental goal. It became a force multiplier. Simulations showed that a 1% improvement in fleet fuel use equated to hundreds of additional sorties per year. Thus, every glide, every idle descent, every precisely timed tanker bracket rippled outward into operational capacity. The philosophy also influenced unmanned systems. The RQ-4 Global Hawk, designed for 30-hour reconnaissance missions, lives almost entirely in the realm of efficiency. Its flight profile mirrors the lessons of half a century. Climb high, throttle back, ride thin air. The aircraft's computer literally kills its jet in code, reducing thrust to near idle during loiter to extend endurance. Environmental and economic echoes, ironically, the same logic that saved pilots now saves budgets. And perhaps the planet. Modern air forces invest heavily in drag reduction coatings, adaptive engines, and blended wing designs not out of sentiment, but necessity. The less fuel burned, the further the reach. When the Air Force Research Laboratory tested the Adaptive Engine Transition Program, AETP, in 2023, engineers cited a figure that would have made old combat pilots smile: 30% better fuel efficiency at cruise. Behind that sterile number lay the echo of every glide through thin air, every decision to trust gravity over throttle. Even civilian aviation has inherited the discipline. Airlines use continuous descent approaches, near-idle glide paths to landing, saving millions of gallons annually. The seeds planted in wartime survival have grown into global sustainability. Human relevance in a machine age. And yet, for all automation, one fact endures. Only humans feel fear. Computers don't flinch when the fuel light blinks. They don't choose faith over noise. That's why flight schools still include manual SFO training, even for aircraft whose computers can glide themselves. The act of closing throttles, of hearing the air replace the engine, is a rite of humility. It reminds every aviator, drone, pilot, or stealth operator that flight is temporary, gravity eternal, and survival depends on discipline. In today's command briefings, instructors sometimes show archival footage, a phantom coasting silently through twilight clouds over the Gulf of Tonkin. That, they tell cadets, is where our technology came from. And the room goes quiet, because even surrounded by glass cockpits and AI co-pilots, they understand. The future of flight still honors the moment when a man once pulled 2 throttles to idle and trusted silence to bring him home. The world of aviation had reached a paradoxical maturity. In conquering the sky, humans learned restraint. The next evolution would not come from faster engines or bigger tanks, but from a deeper awareness that endurance, precision, and patience were the true engines of air power. At its heart, the story of Killing the Jet is not about machines. It's about mindset. The roar of the early jet age promised limitless power, but it was the whisper of restraint that carried aviators farther than they ever imagined. From the frozen runways of Korea to the tropical haze of Vietnam and the deserts of the Middle East, generations of pilots learned the same paradoxical truth. Survival belongs not to the loudest, but to the calmest. When Commander Jack Donovan closed his throttles above the Gulf of Tonkin, he wasn't just conserving fuel. He was embodying a philosophy that would outlive him. Every idle descent since then, every silent glide home, every modern computer optimizing range on an F-35 echoes that same quiet decision. Trust the sky, not the noise. Technology advanced, but human judgment remained the constant. The pilots, who dared to let go, who believed in precision over impulse, proved that mastery isn't measured in thrust. It's measured in grace under pressure. Today, the act of throttling back has become a metaphor as much as a maneuver. It represents the wisdom earned by generations who learned that efficiency is not weakness, it's control. In the grand sweep of aviation history, this discipline reshaped more than tactics. It redefined what it meant to be a professional warrior in the age of machines. For all its equations and doctrine, the lesson remains beautifully simple. The sky rewards those who understand balance. The fighter who knows when to stop fighting, the pilot who knows when to glide, the human who knows when to yield to physics. These are the ones who come home. And somewhere, above a quiet horizon, another young aviator will one day pull both throttles to idle, hear the engines fade, and smile. Not in fear, but in respect. Because in that silence, carried by thin air and memory, lives 70 years of human ingenuity and courage. That is how Americans learned to fly twice as far, by first learning how to stop.